So let's move on now to examine the 5 innovations that Avicenna reckoned he needed to make in order to get Aristotle's logic working as it should do. The first one was about Aristotle's choice of basic sentences. Aristotle talked about every B is an A, and some B's are A's, some B's are not A's, and so on. As if things were always the same in the world, ignoring the fact that there are some properties that things have at some times, and those same things don't have those properties at other times. These properties were known to the traditional logicians as separable accidents, and if you're into artificial intelligence, you may very well know them as fluents. The expression was introduced, fluent, was introduced by John McCarthy in 1963 in his situation calculus. He said he got the word from Isaac Newton. What Avicenna reckoned was that we need to introduce quantifiers over time, or as he sometimes said, over situations, into our basic sentence forms. Now, one consequence of doing that is that some of the Aristotelian laws won't work anymore. For example, Aristotle reckoned that if no B is an A, then it follows that no A is a B. But if we put a time quantifier sometimes in there and start with every B is sometimes not an A, then we can't infer every A is sometimes not a B. I leave it to you to find examples. But for Avicenna, this is very important because, as he points out, this will destroy the first of the arguments that Aristotle gives against the validity of Avicenna's favorite syllogism that we looked at before. So here's progress. One of the bricks of the Aristotle foundation has got knocked out. The second thing that Avicenna reckoned he needed to do was to copy Aristotle's student and successor Theophrastus and study the ways in which we can use the notion of always to express some kind of necessity. Theophrastus, in his own prior analytics, had listed 3 such ways, and Avicenna reckoned that the job could be done better, and he made a list of 6. And this list of 6 ways of expressing a kind of necessity by talking about permanence, Avicenna called necessary predications, and they appear in all of his logical writings from Middle Summary onwards. He must have reckoned that this was a central part of logic to have this list. One of the items in the list takes pride of place, and he's constantly referring to it in later works. This is the case where we say that a thing has a property at all times when that thing exists. In the universal affirmative case, for example, the sentence will say everything that's a B is an A for as long as it exists. In Middle Summary, he calls what's expressed by this sentence form strict necessity. In later writings, he just calls it necessity. And that fact infuriated his successor, the later logician, Fakhruddin al-Razi, who lived and worked in the second half of the 12th century. Al-Razi said, Avicenna and other logicians have got themselves into a state of confusion. Use the Arabic word khabt here, which means a kind of confusion where you keep walking around bumping into things. He said Avicenna and so on have got themselves into confusion by using the word necessary sometimes for inevitable and sometimes for permanent. And the confusion is serious because permanent is a purely temporal condition and inevitable is not. You can't express inevitable just by talking about what happens when. In modern parlance, thanks to von Fricht above all, we call inevitable an alethic modality, and possible is another alethic modality. Well, Fakhruddin al-Razi, with his attack on Avicenna, is partly right and partly wrong. He's certainly right that Avicenna does use the word necessary, both for inevitable and for permanent. But I don't believe he's right in suggesting that Avicenna ever leaves it ambiguous whether in any particular case he means inevitable or he means permanent. In fact, it's usually pretty straightforward to tell which he means by seeing the way the argument is going. And there is an easy test here. If the context contains a temporal quantifier like sometimes, then Avicenna is using necessary to mean permanently or always. On the other hand, if the quantifier possible is sitting around in the context, and then when Avicenna says necessary, he means inevitable. So there doesn't have to be an ambiguity. The third innovation he reckoned he needed to make is this. When we say every B is an A, is there an implied modality on the B? Do we mean everything that's actually a B sometimes, or everything that's actually a B always, or do we mean something that could be a B, that's a possible B? This ambiguity was pointed out and studied in detail by Al-Farabi 100 years before Avicenna. And Al-Farabi designed a kind of methodological trick for analyzing sentences to see just what modalities they had where. His idea was that we say every B is an A, but we add a lot of information as we're saying it about what's in the mind and what is not in the mind of the speaker who's saying this sentence. This format is quite distinctive. Al-Farabi himself calls it said of all, which translates into Latin as dictum de omni. I checked through Avicenna's logical writings and found 27 clear examples of said of all. And here's one for you to look at. It's clear that Avicenna regards this as an important thing to be studied in logic. It's also clear that you can't take a single one of these on its own. You have to take them all together, because what Avicenna includes in two different explanations of the same sentence may vary a bit. I have to say that these things have not been properly noticed in studies of Avicenna's logic, and there is work to be done here. Now, as a result of the 3 innovations that I've listed so far, Avicenna reckoned that he could introduce 8 new sentence forms. And here they are. Every sometime B is always an A, where the always means while the thing exists. Every sometime B is sometimes an A. No sometime B is ever an A, etc., all the way down the list. By the way, when I say sometime B, that's an abbreviation for Avicenna's usual phrase, thing that is sometimes an actual B. So these 8 new sentence forms can be used instead of Aristotle's basic 4 syllogistic forms. And they give us a new logic, which I usually refer to as the DT fragment. I won't explain why. Look what happens here if we take Avicenna's favorite valid syllogism, the one that Aristotle didn't accept, and translate it across into the DT fragment. We get every sometime C is sometimes not a B. Every sometime A is always a B. Therefore, no sometime C is ever an A. You can check that. It's valid. It's very checkable because there are no ambiguities in there, and everything is, as we would say today, extensional. I think that's probably part of what Avicenna was meaning to express when he talked about it being actual. Well, here's some progress. This is not the alethic syllogism that Avicenna started off with in the short epitome, but it's a kind of temporal analogue of it, and it is indeed valid. Now, Aristotle reckoned that we need to have a proof theory for our syllogisms. Some syllogisms, which he called perfect, are so obviously valid that we can regard them as axioms, if you like. All the others need to be proved by being reduced to the perfect ones. Aristotle's methods of reduction don't work for this syllogism we've just looked at. So Avicenna has to find a new type of proof, a non-Aristotelian proof for his favorite syllogisms. It's interesting, one standard account of Avicenna's logic in the modern literature says that Avicenna doesn't give a proof for this syllogism. In fact, he gives 2. He gives one in Middle Summary, and he gives another one later on in his big work, Syllogism. Neither of them is an Aristotelian proof. It's sad to say this is a common phenomenon in the literature, particularly the Western literature on Avicenna, that whenever Avicenna does something different from what Aristotle said, people don't understand what he was doing, and either they ignore it or they regard it as a mistake. So when we come on to the next slice of this lecture, I'll explain to you Avicenna's second method of proof for his syllogism.